Taking things a bit broader in the Middle East, the rift between regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran has heated up since the new year, and that would make it 4 days. The Sunni kingdom announced it was severing diplomatic relations with Tehran yesterday. Now, the sharp decision came after Iranians demonstrators stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran to protest the execution of a prominent Shiite cleric. On Saturday, Riyadh announced the execution of 47 prisoners, including Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, a vocal critic of the Saudi royal family. Now, the move led to widespread protests across the Arab and Muslim world, and Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned that the Sunni Muslim kingdom would face divine revenge for the execution. I am joined in studio by Dr. Raz Zimt from the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Good morning. Let's take a look at the following report, break it down from there.
The rivalry between the two major powers of the Middle East, Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia, has always been volatile, but the situation appears to be reaching a breaking point, threatening to further inflame sectarian violence throughout the region. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei warned Sunday that Saudi Arabia will face, quote, divine vengeance over this weekend's execution of prominent Shiite Saudi cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr.
The Saudi government's decision makers should not underestimate that this blood will trouble them. It will torment them.
On Saturday, Riyadh executed 47 people it considered to be terrorists, including al-Nimr.
The execution was done according to the Sharia law issued against each one of them. The security forces in the kingdom will never hesitate to follow and pursue all who commit such terrorist acts, or even join these groups or support them in any way.
It marked the highest number of executions in one day in Saudi Arabia since the 1980 killing of 63 jihadist rebels who had seized Mecca's Grand Mosque a year earlier. Following the mass execution, Shia Muslims took to the streets throughout the world in protest, from Bahrain to Pakistan, England and Lebanon, and of course in Saudi Arabia itself. In Tehran, Iranian demonstrators stormed the Saudi embassy, smashing furniture and setting fire to the building before being evicted by police.
My personal reaction, I am disgusted, I am outraged. It is an abomination that a human rights defender in this day and age of human rights can be executed for a crime no other than freedom of expression.
Given the regional turmoil, the reigning Al Saud family in Riyadh has grown increasingly concerned that a minority uprising will hit the kingdom, hence Saturday's executions. Al-Nimr was probably the most vocal critique of the ruling dynasty among Saudi Arabia's Shiite minority, and he was seen as a leader of the younger generation, which has grown frustrated by the years-long failure to achieve equality with Sunnis. Tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia are likely to intensify, with the ramifications on its proxy wars from Syria to Yemen still unknown.
With me in studio, Dr. Raz Zimt, as I mentioned, you know what, I'm going to ask you the question I think that's been going on through everybody in the Western world's mind. How bad is this? How dangerous is it? Because Saudi and Iran, at the end of the day, those are the big players on the chessboard that is the Middle East. Can this escalate even further?
It can escalate. Well, the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia were tense before, and we've seen several incidents during the last year. In September, more than 400 Iranian pilgrims were killed in the disaster in Saudi Arabia. A few months before, we had alleged sexual assault on 2 Iranian pilgrims in Saudi Arabia, and of course, those two states are engaged in proxy war in 4 countries: in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Bahrain. So but it can escalate. We remember that in 2011, the Revolutionary Guards plotted to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington. Iranians were engaged in cyber attacks against Aramco, against the oil company of Saudi Arabia. So it can escalate, although I don't think that the two states are after uncontrollable military escalations.
Right. Uncontrollable military, then what? Then in this incident, at this point, because we're looking
at this point. Yeah.
At this point, but
they are already heavily involved. Iran is heavily involved in Syria. The Saudis are already involved in Yemen. So they don't. I don't see a scenario where missiles from Iran are going to be launched in Saudi Arabia right now. there is still
we still have time to that war, so to speak.
We can still see subversion. We can see some terrorist attack, and not entirely going to military.
All
attacks.
this play, and at the end of the day, we in the Western world are looking at how is this going to affect the Iran deal? Will this even affect the Iran deal?
I don't think so. I think what can affect the Iran deal is especially what's going on right now in the United States and all this talks about reimposing sanctions against Iran. This is used and this is presented by the hardliners in Iran as an evidence that the United States should not be trusted.
Should not be trusted. And speaking of that, because the White House has delayed applying fresh sanctions on Tehran over its missile program, and this is all as Iranian President Hassan Rouhani publicly ordered his military to dramatically scale up the country's missile program if the sanctions went ahead. Now, opponents of the Iran nuclear deal say that lack of enforcement on the ballistic missile issue risks the implementation of the greater deal. Let's go to D.C., where Rebecca Shimoni-Stoyle is joining us on the phone, Times of Israel correspondent in Washington, D.C. Rebecca, asking you this now, with the delaying of these sanctions, first of all, that's coming out of Washington. What's the excuse for delaying those sanctions right now?
Well, good morning. Yes, we're hearing more and more about this delay of sanctions. And really what the administration has indicated is that they still need a little bit more time to consider the implications of the sanctions and that they're going to talk to Congress a little bit more about the steps that they're planning on taking. One of the suggestions that we've heard, however, is that the real reason behind this delay is to give President Rouhani a little bit more wiggle room, especially given that Rouhani himself is facing elections and facing conservatives in those elections coming up in February. And so the idea is that by delaying the sanctions, it helps not put Rouhani on the spot in terms of defending the nuclear deal before his own kind of conservative backlash.
No, entirely. And if you can stay with us, Dr. Raztin, would you agree that, I mean, I don't know if President Obama can swing postponing those sanctions many times. If those were put in place right now, how would that go? How would that bode for Rouhani?
I think this is a very sensitive time in Iran because of the parliamentary elections due in February. So Rouhani has to be given the opportunity to deliver his economic promises to the Iranians. So they need the sanctions to be lifted. If the sanctions are reimposed, the hardliners in Iran will use that as an excuse to come and say, well, you were wrong. You and Foreign Minister Zarif were wrong. The Americans should not be trusted, and perhaps we should reconsider the deal.
The deal in itself. And Rebecca, if you're still with us, is that something that the American president can swing at this point?
Well, this would require a little bit of a balancing act in terms of putting them off for, say, 4 or 6 weeks. This is a response that that many in Washington have thought is coming for a while. And certainly after the United Nations Security Council said that the ballistic missiles tests had in fact violated ballistic missiles test bans earlier this fall, there was a huge outcry even among people who supported the Iran deal in Washington, calling for not a renewal of nuclear sanctions, but an imposition of additional anti-ballistic missile sanctions. And so in order to maintain this kind of halfway zone, saying that sanctions are in order but not actually imposing them, Washington's going to have to do, or the administration's going to have to do a lot of juggling, not between itself and its traditional opponents, but also between some of its own supporters on the Iran deal.
Yeah, no, there's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot of dancing going on. Thank you, Rebecca. I want to thank you, Raztin, for joining us this morning. Iran, Saudi, still no big war for all those concerned, but everything is at play. Stay